Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Happy early Halloween if you're watching this when I upload it, and if not, happy random, not necessarily significant day of the year. In recognition of the impending holiday, or festivities, or whatever Halloween's considered now, I'll be delaying the first episode of 1999 in the animated 90s, and instead doing a couple that focus on the creepy, disturbing, and downright spooky stuff from mostly 80s animation. And don't worry, they won't all be G.I. Joe. Here's an advanced warning that these videos will contain some potentially disturbing images for people who don't like clowns or spiders or that sort of thing, and even some talk of more adult themes, like assault in some episodes, so viewer beware. I'm also going to be looking at each scene both as it would have felt to a kid and from the perspective of now as an adult, so it gets a little dark in spots too. But I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Pun actually very much intended this time, so let's jump into the top 10 creepiest and most disturbing moments from G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero. Let's start this list slow with some moments that just kind of fall into the creepy or unsettling categories rather than straight up disturbing or scary. The first of these on this list is going to be from episode 53 in the first season, Flints Vacation. This one is about Flint taking some time off and going to visit family, only to find them behaving very strangely. The unsettling part of the episode is in how robotic and unemotive the family members act and the cold way they barely register Flint's presence. There's also a fairly disturbing dream sequence in here. Of course, we find out it's a Cobra plot and they're mind controlling the whole town, which as an adult looking back makes it even creepier, really. Can you imagine having your free will completely subjugated 24/7? I wonder if all the controlled people were stuck in their bodies like unwilling passengers. There are some other things in the episode to be afraid of too, like the teenage kids being forced to share a bedroom. But the most chilling thing of all is for any veteran watching, because Flint wears his beret in his civilian clothes. That's a huge no-no, and incredibly disturbing. Next up on the list is one that gets a spot from its atmospheric creepiness. Arise, Serpentor Arise didn't really have anything scary going on, but with the whole grave robbing angle and some of the tomb raiding, there were definitely some parts that felt a little spooky, especially with Cobra's antics in Transylvania. For those of you who don't know, the miniseries served as the season 2 premiere and was about Cobra taking DNA from ancient warriors to create Serpentor, and one of those warriors just happened to be Dracula. Sure, we eventually learned that all of the scares in the episode were Scooby-Doo fake-outs, but the ambient sounds and the ethereal specter in the castle were still creepy at the time. Plus, there was that Frankenstein-like imagery of Serpentor finally awakening to add some extra eeriness as well. From the perspective of now looking back, though, the entire concept of gene splicing and artificial humans and boutique personality traits sounds a little too eugenics-y for my liking, in the most Star Trek way possible. It wasn't the most disturbing of episodes, but it definitely had some creepy concepts and visuals. Moving on to number 8, we have an episode that leverages some good old-fashioned Cronenbergian body horror with Iceberg Goes South. For some reason, the show increased the scariness in Season 2, and this episode was a good example. In this episode, Cobra is developing a serum that can create human-animal hybrids. It's filled with various animal attacks throughout, including from wolfmen, human-walrus hybrids, and even polar bear soldiers. The body horror, though, comes in when Iceberg is captured and Cobra injects him with a version of the serum to turn him into an orca, or killer whale if you're not an animal or biology buff. Side note, did you all know they're actually dolphins, not whales? But I digress. We see the transformation that Iceberg goes through as he essentially becomes pure orca, not human-orca hybrid, and hearing him try to speak while in that form and hunt some of the other characters is a little unsettling for kids. There's not much there to bother an adult, though, other than the idea of having your mind replaced by one with completely foreign thought processes, or if you're a sciencey person like I am, the total disregard for conservation of energy and conservation of mass that the transformation has is pretty disturbing too. My number 7 slot goes to an episode that has a creep factor built on the power of a single image, and brings to mind some old-school Twilight Zone. Glamour Girls was another Season 2 episode about Dr. Mindbender creating a youth-stealing machine that could make old people young again, but when it did so, the young people used as fuel were left with no face at all. The Joes get involved with the whole thing because Lowlight's sister is one of the models who gets captured to power the machine. The no-face imagery is bad enough, but as an adult looking back, there are other aspects of the episode that make it even creepier, specifically from the hypnotizing young women perspective. Seeing the models come out of their trance surrounded by dreadnoughts is almost worse than the thought of them losing their faces. And then there was a scene where the Dreadnoks used the hypno camera on Zorana to...
Here, boys, let's have some fun.
And the extent of that sort of vulnerability is just kind of disconcerting. Oh, and there's also the whole idea of getting older, which those of us who are fans of G.I. Joe back when it originally aired probably feel pretty intently. But the face thing is what gets it on the list in the first place, and that final scene with the woman screaming and Lifeline saying there's nothing he can do is just kind of chilling. For number 6 here, I'm going to reiterate my warning from a little earlier and let you all know that it contains some animal cruelty. It's Cobras Creatures, which is actually a pretty early Season 1 episode. In it, a scientist named Dr. Lucifer is working with Cobra on an animal controlling device called High Freak. Cobra kidnaps Mutt and Junkyard to test the device by making Junkyard hunt his partner. The episode is filled with some downright scary animal attack imagery and the unsettling thoughts of having something you love turn on you. The worst of the animal attacks, though, isn't from Junkyard, but instead is a scene where Scarlet and Ripcord get absolutely swarmed by spiders. I personally hate spiders, and this scene really doesn't sit too well with me. Most traumatic of all, though, is thinking Junkyard may be hurt, or worse, which was pretty rough for a kid. From the adult perspective, the episode is disturbing throughout because of the relationship between man and dog, and Mutt's voice actor, Bill Morey, sells despair and anguish better than anyone else throughout the entire series. Hearing him plead with Junkyard and do everything he can to not have to hurt him is heart-wrenching. It's probably the most emotionally disturbing episode in the entire series. Well, almost. Even watching today. Let's go from Cronenberg to Geiger with my number 5 pick, though, G.I. Joe the Movie. There wasn't really any single thing about this adventure that was creepy or upsetting so much as overall design and imagery of Cobra Law throughout. The fleshy, insectoid style of all of the organic technology was gross a lot of the time. Sure, the designs aren't as hardcore in most instances as true Geiger work, like the Xenomorph, but they're still pretty creepy. Also, if you pronounce it Giger, I don't know, I'm just kind of winging it. The fact that such technology and weaponry continuously defeated and captured the Joes throughout the film made it even worse. There were some fairly kid-frightening scenes with the Nemesis Enforcer, too, that boosted the creep factor. Lastly, and even though I said we moved away from Cronenberg, there was the body horror of Cobra Commander slowly becoming a snake throughout, and the repeated screams of "was a man" had a bit of an edge. Worst of all for a kid, though, were Duke getting impaled and the baton to the eye Falcon gives Colobulus. For an adult, looking back now, nothing in the movie is really that bad except for some of the disturbing connotations with the grabbing vines and Thrasher's attempted assault on Zorana. But then again, the whole
Was a man
thing still tickles something in the back of the brain. Also, being the second attempted assault against Zorana on this list, it sure does make the Dreadnoks worse in hindsight than they ever were to kids at the time, though, doesn't it? As long as we're working our way through the various masters of horror, let's take a look at something Lovecraftian with my number 4 choice. It's Skeletons in the Closet, which was a late Season 1 episode that centered around cults and creatures and other such spookiness. Beyond the basic atmospheric horror of the castle setting and the phantom Lady J encounters, not to mention the skeletons and the sketchy housekeeper, there are several other aspects to it that could be a little intense for kids. The masks that the worshippers wear are disturbing in a lot of instances, and their monotonous chanting and ritualistic behavior makes it even worse. Things hit their full Dagon peak, though, when the cult tries to sacrifice Lady J to an actual real-life pit monster, which Destro implies at the end of the episode may very well have been a real-life elder god-type entity. Oh, and the giant spider is nightmare fuel, too. For adults, though, most anything cult-like can be unsettling, but the human aspect of the episode is probably the most disturbing, as Baroness has been scheming the whole time to hurt Destro for some implied infidelity. Doing so costs him his ancestral home and potentially several of his family members, not to mention unleashes the creature. Some of those are just very real-world concerns that most of us probably prefer not to think about. The top 3 on this list really push the envelope for content geared toward children, and in some cases go straight into probably being too much. Number 3 here goes to Nightmare Assault, an episode where Dr. Mindbender creates a machine that causes the Joes to have severe nightmares and be unable to sleep. The various nightmares throughout are pretty snake-heavy, but they still do a good job of playing on the fears of the specific Joes they target too. Things like Lifeline being unable to save Iceberg and having to use a weapon against his own moral code, Hawk losing the entire team under his command, and Lowlight reliving an actual childhood trauma are pretty mature scenes, and some later imagery like Mainframe turning into a robot and the whole team nearly being immolated are just plain scary. The episode may be even worse to watch from an adult perspective though, as even though the nightmares may not be too much for us, the fact that the characters suffer through sleep deprivation is something I bet we can all relate to. The biggest impact to viewers of a more advanced age, though, was from the fact that Lowlight had to deal with being the victim of very real child abuse and overcome what was likely some actual PTSD for the character to be able to save the day. The episode really made one of the coolest Joe characters even more cool, but also a lot more tragic at the same time. So I kind of went back and forth with myself about what order I wanted to put the last two in, but eventually I decided that Worlds Without End was the less disturbing episode of the two. This one was another pretty early Season 1 two-parter that saw a handful of Joes being transported to an alternate dimension Earth that had been conquered and subjugated by Cobra. The concept alone is scary in a man-in-the-high-castle sort of way, but the really terrifying part starts with Steeler being bitten by some mutated insect and becoming progressively more sick throughout the episodes. The way he seems to deteriorate more and more in every scene, even fighting Grunt at one point, was a bit upsetting for little kids. Of course, it all culminates with him and Grunt finding the skeletons of their alternate dimension counterparts and realizing that their other selves fell to Cobra in this world. This part can be rough for adults as well, since none of us like to be confronted with our own mortality. But there's more to it that we can see now that we couldn't as kids. Specifically, the fact that Grunt, Steeler, and Clutch's skeletons are all piled up in a ditch with nothing else around pretty much implies they are probably lined up and executed, which makes this world's version of Cobra a lot more vicious than ours. Not to mention the episodes end with our Grunt, Steeler, and Clutch deciding to stay behind and help the Baroness in a coup that's most likely doomed to fail, and doesn't bode well for their future. And that's a hard situation to see any beloved character in. I'm not doing any honorable mentions here because this one's already getting a little long-winded, but if you were to want some, I'd say the creepy clown from the Games Master would be a good candidate. What we're really here for, though, is my number one pick, the most disturbing episode of G.I. Joe ever made, the Season 1 two-part finale, There's No Place Like Springfield. These episodes have a lot going on to mess with our minds, with some pretty substantial psychological horror and some real body horror throughout. We start off with kind of a scary scene of Shipwreck's implied drowning, before jumping straight into a reality that just seems off. Shipwreck has a family and lives in a world where he's been told that the Joes were disbanded, but keeps experiencing strange waking dreams and hallucinations. The show contains some creepy dream sequences, a pretty hardcore interrogation scene that's fairly intense, and worse than anything else, the melting of some of our favorite characters. The first time we see that happen, with a smiling roadblock turning into a puddle of goo, is just plain shocking. Maybe even worse, though, is later when Shipwreck has to fight Torpedo, Deep Six, Duke, and Scarlet, as they talk about how much of a failure he is. Each melts away after a single hit, with Scarlet eventually doing so in his arms. The absolute most disturbing part of this show, though, is even after he realizes that everything around him is fake, the episodes still end with Shipwreck running into a burning house to save his wife and kid, only to find them ready to confront him at gunpoint, and then eventually get melted before his eyes when Polly hits him with a destabilizer. That final scene shows just how much of an impact the events had on Shipwreck, and just leaves viewers feeling kinda chilled, kids and adults alike. But that's it for my top 10 creepiest and most disturbing scenes and episodes from the original series of G.I. Joe. Sorry if it took a turn and got more dark than anyone was expecting as we went, but I thought it was significant to look at each from both the perspective of how we saw them originally and how we perceive them today. I promise I'll make the other Halloween content I put out more lighthearted. If you made it to this point, though, I appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts on the topic in the comments. I've got another Halloween-themed video on deck in the next couple of days, so like and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.